Jessie is a dual degree UC Berkeley graduate student from the Energy and Resources group, as well as the Goldman School of Public Policy. And before graduate school, she worked for the US Department of Energy on the proliferation of energy efficient technologies. While she's been here at UNSW, she's mostly been working on her master's thesis, focusing on how energy policies of developed nations have affected global renewable energy technology learning curves. And I think I'll let you take it from there.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Sharon. So as Sharon so eloquently put, I'm from UC Berkeley. I've been here for a couple months working at the Climate Change Research Center with Donna Green, and I've learned a lot since I've been here. Most of you guys like to shorten literally every word, even your great nation's name, twice. Not AUS, OZ. AUS is too long. So yeah, I've been working on learning curves since I've been here, and this is a relatively new area of research for me, so I would prefer if you guys just jump in with questions, but we'll also have some questions at the end, if that's okay with the administrators, okay. And yeah, so anything that you feel or want to say, so such as you're crazy or how does this add to the body of research, anything like that, fair game. All right. So this is the order of operations. Going to give you guys a little bit of background and motivation to start off with as to why I wanted to look into this to begin with. So if you imagine these two bars represent the cost of producing a megawatt hour of electricity with fossil fuels on the left, the black bar, dirty, and renewable resources on the right, basically I would like to just internalize that externality, the pollution externality that we're all so familiar with and hate so much. So there's a couple ways you can do that. You can either increase the cost, and also just bring these into cost parity so they actually have level playing ground to fight against. So there's a couple ways you can do that. You can increase the cost of fossil fuel resources, or you can reduce the cost of renewable resources. And you can do that through a number of different policies that I'm sure you all are familiar with. The Renewable Portfolio Standard, which designates a certain amount of capacity be installed by utility companies on the grid, effectively increases the cost of fossil fuel resources, as does a cap and trade program that just internalizes that externality, as does carbon tax or sunsetting some of the subsidies that the fossil fuel industry enjoys today. There's also ways you can reduce the cost of renewable resources. Obviously, you can give them tax incentives. You can give them a feed-in tariff or net energy metering where you pay people for the energy they produce under those regimes. But obviously, there's a little bit more going on to the picture, right? That was a very simplified model of kind of what happens. So what's actually happening is when you're instituting these policies, you're increasing the cost of fossil fuel resources, and hopefully you're driving more capacity to be installed on the grid. And by doing that, you actually instigate a bit of learning on the renewable energy side. So every time more capacity is installed, the cost goes down, economies of scale, people learning what they're doing over time. And that's true for every single policy measure, including the policy measures on the right. And learning itself actually instigates more learning, reduces the cost, increases the likelihood that more capacity will be added to the grid, and learning kind of begets learning. So here I've modeled learning as a very small component because just for the sake of kind of the bars being averaged, but learning actually is the largest component to reducing the cost of technology over time, larger even so than climate policies overall. So let's see, I'll this a little backwards, sorry. So there's two different kinds of policies to institute those different measures, right? There's supply push, which is advances science and technology, and there's demand pull, which changes market demand, essentially pulling those technologies into the market. Some of the policies that fall into those categories are supply push are mostly R&D, international cooperation and education and training, and also for the demand pull side, tax incentives, subsidies, cap and trade, and RPS. So those two types of policy measures or types of policy categories are the two that you can sort of break down as they pertain to energy. And the literature supports that neither of these types of policy categories alone can sustain or can bring forth this kind of technology change that we need to see in order to kind of usher in the next generation. So my question is, how do we optimize using these two types of policies throughout the life of a technology to optimize learning throughout the entire sort of learning curve? So how can we get sort of the best bang for our buck for instituting R&D measures or instituting tax incentives? When should we put them in place? And how much can we drive the cost down with these? and potentially what is the tipping point for sort of allowing these technologies to become commercial scale. So next up, tech change in climate and energy models. So how do we think about technology and learning today in our models? So technology has a huge impact on the sort of the overall achievability of all of the emission scenarios that we've put forth so far. What you're looking at in the graph is the IPCC special reports on emission scenario, and that gray area is the technology included in the baseline. So it's actually, that's actually that black bar there where it says SERS A2 scenario, that is the baseline. So they are assuming that the technology change is going to be so vast that we will actually be at that point in 2100. That's a little bit dangerous. So I was wondering sort of what's in that baseline scenario? How are they assuming that much technology is going to sort of come about? So that's from 1990 is the start and 2100 is the end. And that's such a large impact, sort of where is that coming from? So actually, in going forward, all of the scenarios, I don't know if you guys have ever had the feeling that you read sort of these climate change papers and we have the same goals going forward. It seems like they just keep rolling over decade to decade. Has anyone else got that sense? And that's actually because of technology. We've just gotten more and more optimistic about that giant gap there in the end. So I was wondering kind of where the motivations for that were coming from and how we were actually going to achieve that. So over the years, we've gotten increasingly more reliant on technology change in all of our models. And we're procrastinating, which I think we can all relate to, but maybe our grandchildren won't like us for very much. So, and kind of rightfully so to a certain extent, though, because technology has actually changed in the recent past, as I'm sure you all know, at a very rapid rate. So we can rely on it to a certain extent, but to what extent can we and how will we get there? And as of today, no models actually project the likelihood of achieving any of these scenarios. So they kind of just factor it in and assume that we're going to, and there's no uncertainty or risk analysis around it. So they all rely on R&D spending going up, going essentially through the roof. And if you look at this graph, that's not exactly what's happening. So the United States is on the top, Australia I've highlighted for you guys is below, and that black bar in the middle is the international average. So it's essentially averaged out. And I tried to put in here also the energy one, but it basically mimics this is overall R&D spending on everything, which there's a lot of spillovers, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later, so it kind of factors in. But basically, if you look at the trajectory of R&D spending, it's actually slated to go down in the recent future, so it's not exactly increasing at the swift rate that we would need in order to get that giant gap filled. So what do all these bars mean? So not only does technology change the most important factor contributing to climate stabilization, it's also the most important factor for how much that's going to cost us. So if you look at the green bar in sort of the furthest corner, well, the axis, I guess, are different emission scenarios, different climate stabilization scenarios. The z-axis is how much, this is a solar PV, and that's a 9-cent baseline. So if we reduced it to 6 cents, how much money we could save, which is on the y-axis. So we reduce it to 4 cents, how much money we could save, and those are cumulative. So if you sort of add them all up, it's trillions of dollars in savings, depending on how much you could reduce the cost of a certain technology just by a pretty incremental amount. I'm sure you guys are interested in that, all the solar PV people. All right. So it's important to note that all of those savings are already incorporated in the baseline. So those are assumed savings. So where did all those come from? I'm actually going to take a moment and kind of pause here to explain. So there's two different ways that you can incorporate technology change in a climate model. In all of today's large economic models, climate economic models, technology change is included exogenously, which means it's incorporated as just a percentage change over time. It's either an increase in efficiency or a decrease in cost over time. That's it, straight line level. There's a few models that have been popping up in the recent years where they incorporate it endogenously, which basically means that technology change is affected by technology change and also the environment in which it is occurring. So any policies, any climate mitigation policies, R&D policies are actually directly affecting the increase in technology change over time, which kind of makes sense. That's how the real world works. Nothing is in a straight line. So just with that in mind, all of our models are that we currently use are exogenous models for large energy economic models internationally. So if you look at this graph, this is the ETC is standing for endogenous technology change, and you can see the difference in cost trajectory of incorporating technology change endogenously versus exogenously. So without endogenous incorporation is that red line that goes kind of through the roof, and with it is that kind of orangish line down at the bottom there. So the reason for that is that technology change is not linear, it's cumulative, and it kind of builds on itself. So any R&D that we do today has spillover effects and has ripples throughout the economy that just have economic benefit that are immeasurable to us. So the endogenous, as I sort of just alluded to, focuses more on shifting action further or sooner. So it doesn't, exogenous, when you incorporate the technology change exogenously, essentially what you're doing is you're allowing the model to capture future energy or future savings in that, or assuming that technology change will occur, and you're abating further out so that you can do it relatively cheaper, if that makes sense. So the model is optimizing for that. Whereas the endogenous technology change is taking action sooner so that the buildup can happen and that exponential increase in technology learning and knowledge capacity can build. So the economic benefits of technology improvements are highly nonlinear and cumulative in nature. And this just shows, the graph shows that achieving certain emission scenarios under exogenous versus endogenous and how that might play out. All right, so in order to incorporate in a model, technology change in a model endogenously, you have to use learning curves. So we're not using that straight line percentage change anymore. We're gonna use the learning curves, and I'm gonna explain to you sort of what those are and how they are incorporated. So these are learning curves. They're pretty simple. There's two basic components. It's just cumulative installed capacity versus cost over time. These are some for different technologies over different time periods. You'll notice that nuclear is not the brightest crayon in the box, and cost actually goes up. It has a negative learning, and which is due to all the regulations. It's not nuclear's fault. So this typically is put on this is just the equation for that line, just a linear. It's typically put on a log-log scale to make it easier for us humans to consume. And it looks a little bit like that then. The equation looks a little bit like that. So the first thing you're looking at is just the specific cost of a unit of cumulative capacity at that moment, where B is just the slope and X is a surrogate for everything that changes the technology cost over time, literally everything. So you might think that's a lot of things to put into one factor, which is exactly what I thought too. But one of the strengths of this model is that we actually have numbers on these two things. We have empirical data on both the cost and the cumulative capacity of technologies over time, which is great. So there are some benefits to this. Some of the downsides are that everybody likes to do it their own way. So cost can be in dollars per kilowatt or dollars per kilowatt hour, and as you probably guessed, capacity can be in kilowatts or kilowatt hours as well. So it's not comparing apples to apples a lot of times, and when you go from nation to nation, which is a problem. And as you'll see later on, there's a lot more differences that kind of pile on top of that. So the strength of this is that it is based on empirical data. There is another model. Also the learning rate is just that's sort of an easy way for the industry to designate over time how things change, and it's just with every doubling of capacity, what happens to the cost. So that's what that equation signifies. There is sort of a better model that has been built that does a better job of projecting technology change and so costs and cumulative capacity over time, called the two-factor model, which factors in learning by doing, that's at B, LBD, and learning by research. So that's exactly what it sounds like. It's anything that happens post installation of sort of commercial scale technologies is learning by doing. Anything that happens prior to that is learning by research. So it's essentially splitting those two things out. And they do that just based on how much money is invested in those two buckets during those periods of time, essentially. So the three main components that have been identified to factor into technology change over time are R&D, as you all might have guessed, and spillovers and learning. So those learning and R&D are incorporated in this, but unfortunately spillovers are one of those sort of nebulous concepts that nobody can kind of grapple with, and it hasn't yet been able to be factored into any of the models that we use in a realistic way. So whereas spillover just denotes anytime a company or a government invests in a technology, they don't get to reap all of those benefits of that investment. Some of them spill over into other economies. So if somebody, a person works at Infigen and they go over to the US and they sort of share some of the secrets of how the wind industry runs in California, or in Australia with California, for example, that's a spillover. But those spillovers are a huge component of learning. So by sort of limiting it to these only these two factors, you're kind of doing yourself a disservice again, right? So you're not factoring in everything. There are still some issues with that. So there are also other forms, or sort of slightly variant forms on this, which is called the component-based model, where basically every single component of a technology is broken out and has its own learning curve. So if you're talking about a wind turbine, you can break it down to the actual turbine. You can do the whole nacelle. Just break it down however the component itself is structured and however you want it to be structured in your model. And I'll talk a little bit about how that's used. So basically, each individual one has a learning curve, and then they're aggregated up into one giant learning curve for the technology. So these models show improvement in forecasting in the short run, the two-factor and the component-based models, especially when you layer them on top of each other. But unfortunately, our empirical understanding of that data, learning by doing and learning by research, in the long run is no better than exogenous data. So we've only seen benefits sort of in like a 20-year period, which, as we all know, for energy technologies is pretty limited. Questions so far? Quiet crowd. All right, so there are a lot of complications that come along with even these models. So this is a survey of 76 different learning curve models, all the ones that I could find so far, that in all of the sort of the variations in the learning rates from those different models. If you look at just onshore wind, it goes from -11 to 32%. Those are all over the place. That's pretty useless for almost anything. And you can see here some of the other variables that I alluded to that can vary. So the period of time in which you're focusing on, the area that you're focusing on, so the geographic area, obviously the technology breakdown, so on and so forth. So you can also probably see in here that the more mature the technology gets, the slightly smaller window you get, which is kind of a good thing, or we would expect that, I suppose. So all of these differences are just due to theoretical differences in how people are approaching learning curves, which is kind of a problem because it's hard to compare across learning curve models and get sort of any useful information out of them. If you boil this down to the 4 top models that are being used internationally right now, the windows get a little bit smaller, so there's only a 2% variation, which is good, or we're getting there. But the reason for these, obviously, even within these models, is just the different methodologies employed in creating them. So I'm going to go a little bit into the learning curves for 2 of the greatest nations in the world, the US and Australia, to give you guys an idea of how some of these might vary. So starting with the global and local learning model, which is Australia's model. The global and local learning model does something really interesting. It's based on the IEA's ARIS model, which was just in that graph that we saw a second ago, or the table rather. And it does something very unique in that it distinguishes international learning from local learning. So essentially what they're saying is that at a local level, you might have that learning by doing rate, and that might skyrocket because people are teaching each other how to do things. The installation costs are getting cheaper. They break out that BOS costs, the balance of system costs, which is essentially anything that's not the actual sort of component that you buy, the generation component. So they break those 2 out, and this is an example of the wind model for that. This is the international breakout of the turbine cost itself and the installation cost. And then they actually layer on top their local learning. So this is the installation cost and installation experience curve at the local level for Australia. So in order to do this, they break it into 3 regions. The only important regions, evidently, for Australia are the developing world, the developed world, and Australia. That's all we need to know about. That's the end of the story. But they understand that we live in a globalized society, and so learning can occur at multiple different levels and spill over, especially with your country that's sort of out in the middle of the ocean and everyone forgets about it. Just kidding. They understand that there's a lot of learning that happens at the local level that has no applicability to the international cost, right? So they have this really interesting model that I've been trying to sort of break into CSIRO and figure out. If anyone knows anyone there or has the passcode to get in, let me know. They also do something really interesting where there's been a lot of ups and downs in the financial markets as they pertain to renewable energy. And instead of, a lot of people just kind of throw those out as anomalies, but they actually factor it in as a market penalty. So when market forces are, including something like high demand or the firms kind of capitalize a market and they increase their profits by a large margin, they actually give the technology itself a penalty. And they also, as a restriction on their model, they have 30% intermittency penetration on the grid, sort of just baseline, so that they allow. So moving on to the U.S. model, the National Energy Modeling System. So it is actually a hybrid bottom-up, top-down model. They use the component method, and I should also note that the GALM, the Australian model, they use endogenous learning, just as an FYI. So NEMS also uses endogenous learning, and they actually break theirs down into 3 stages. So it's kind of, it's very complicated, but basically for 3 doublings of installed capacity after the first commercial installation, it goes from a revolutionary stage to an evolutionary stage. And after 5 doublings, it goes into a conventional stage. So that's sort of anything that is matured. And there are learning rates associated with each one of those stages. So at the revolutionary stage, there's a baseline learning rate of 10%. And at the evolutionary stage, it's 5%. And at the conventional stage, it's only 1%. And there are a number of different ways that those rates can change based on the certain technology. This is kind of just like the baseline raw bones or straw man model. They also distinguish between local and international learning, but in a slightly different way than Australia. They actually say that basically any foreign units of new technologies are assumed to contribute to the reductions in the cost of that technology on US soil if the company has a certain sort of quota of manufacturing happening or installations happening on US soil, or if our economies are tied very closely. So essentially, if it's kind of a rate of whether or not the spillover can actually occur. And it's kind of just somebody drew a line a little bit. It's kind of an educated guessing. So their constraints, as opposed to implementing a penalty on these technologies for market forces, NEMS actually incorporates market forces exogenously, so they just kind of assume over time that there's going to be a certain level of market force in the model, and they just sort of let it play out based on a baseline change. And the learning by doing is limited to only 50% in any given year. The 6 parameters that can affect, I told you that this is kind of with the bare bones, and when they go through the 6 parameters that can affect a technology's learning curve overall are the baseline capacity, so what they judge to be sort of the commercial installed capacity that they're measuring from, the learning capacity growth year to year, so which determines the number of doublings annually, and the learning rate, so that's kind of the overall, that's that 10% is kind of just, they give it a baseline learning rate as well. The minimal annual learning, which I told you guys, the vintage, which is that revolutionary, evolutionary, or mature, and the technological optimism factor, which is a counterbalancing factor that accounts for the uncertainty due to technology optimism that we have when people say, oh, it's only going to cost you $10 to install this fuel cell, and we know that they're going to go cost overrun by about 1,000%. So they have an optimism factor that they sort of penalize. They do have sort of a penalty. It should be noted that the distinguishing between the stages in a technology in these 3 different classes has been done in a number of other studies, and it works really well for projecting technology change in the short run. So again, we're working on about a 15-year period, but beyond that, it starts to break down a little bit. All right, so my research. I'm only gonna give you guys a little bit of a teaser. I don't have any data on this right now. I have a little bit, but it's not ready to kind of present. So I'm just gonna talk you through sort of what I'm working on and hopefully get your feedback on it. So I'm working on right now, if you look at the 2-factor learning curve, there's a problem with, it's good in that it breaks out the 2 different components of learning, so the R&D component and the learning by doing, but it actually doesn't, and so there is some causality that you can draw from that, but it actually doesn't do a very good job at differentiating them for the purposes of policy implementation because it assumes substitutability of those two things. So it assumes that one unit of learning by doing is the exact same as a unit of R&D, which obviously it is not. There's a time component involved. It's an entirely different kind of playing field that you're working in, right? So the models have no way of distinguishing that. And sort of it would be extremely useful for policymakers if they could distinguish that measure, right? So my sort of theory is that you can, instead of doing this whole tripling for every, when you get up to sort of 3 doublings of the capacities of the 2 breakdowns that we have in the National Energy Modeling System currently, you could actually look historically at the variation in supply push technologies versus demand pull technologies after adding in an interaction term in the middle. So no one has ever done that before, which I find fascinating because it's actually been alluded to in almost all the research that in that middle zone where the technology is in the evolutionary stage, those 2 types of technology, or those 2 types of policies rather, are working in tandem like they've never worked in tandem before. So you have one pushing, you have one pulling, you can imagine what happens. So no one's ever done that, and essentially adding that interaction term in the middle, just that essentially multiplying B LBR by B LBD and doing a sensitivity analysis of when the supply push and demand pull have the greatest effect is what I'm currently working on. But in order to do that, I'm the whole sort of first phase is mapping the data of policy implementation on top of learning curve data, which the US, thankfully, a lot of it is open source, but everywhere else it is not so much. So I'm currently working on that. And I am interested in sort of specifically the crossover section between an evolutionary to a conventional stage, because the modeling gets a lot more rigorous then, as I alluded before. The more the technology matures, the better the models actually start to project what's actually going to happen. So just to recap, currently we are using exogenous models. We are incorporating technology change exogenously. I would argue that we need to incorporate it endogenously, because that shifts our sort of policy thinking into a frame of acting earlier as opposed to putting things off in this expectation that we will have cheaper abatement in the future when actually there is sort of no projection of that happening. And it just gives us an easy out and gives our politicians an easy out. And also, if we incorporate them endogenously, I would like to see a 2-factor model so that we can actually start to break out the learning by doing and learning by research and potentially even go beyond that and focus on incorporating all these technologies onto the grid. This is Hazel. She would like to know if you have questions. Yeah?
I'm not sure if Hazel will know this, but something that's happening in both our countries and elsewhere as well at the moment seems to be that funding agencies for renewable energy or photovoltaics are starting to think, well, you've done the job, we don't really, the prices come down,
right.
We don't really need to do anything anymore, and it will just keep on coming down by itself. Is your research able to, or is something that will come out of your research something that will give the research community a tool to say, this is what we need to keep doing, this is the bit that is driven by research?
Right, so I'm going to say your question back to you, just make sure I got it right. So you're saying that we need policy implementation that has a really, it's very permanent and doesn't have any chance of sort of being pulled out? Is that what you're saying?
Sort of. Our research funding, the funding for this whole area in the world is under threat because it's seen as not being required anymore.
Oh, right, okay. So they're essentially saying that it's moved on to the conventional stage.
If we stop doing R&D for now, will the learning curve change?
Yeah. So that actually was also one of the motivating questions when I first got into this, specifically because in the US, the solar in and of itself has been a technology that's driven a lot of these arguments, saying that the cost is so low, we don't need to incentivize it anymore, let's start pulling out of all these net energy metering and all of that. But what they're not understanding is that the learning curve modeling itself is incorporating all of those policies as the cost, right? So those are already, it's set the cost in the market. And if you incorporate in the model a higher cost, the curve entirely changes, right? So even with, they set the market price with those policies, and if they pull them out, the cost would instantly change. So the learning would still have occurred and will still be occurring, but the cost itself will be entirely different because you don't have the subsidy anymore. There's been some models in the US. We have the investment tax credit for wind, which has sunsetted multiple times over the past 5 years. And you can see this roller coaster effect going on in the industry where installations shoot up and then they plummet and then they shoot up and they plummet, and it's been touted that it isn't good for the market or it's not good for research, and you're not allowing a momentum to get started essentially, which to a certain extent in the data is being shown as true, but there's kind of a backlash that's happening because they get a little bit of notice, the industry gets a bit of notice that these policies are going to sunset, so they hurry up and install really quick and they kind of break ground. So they're getting these incentives so that you actually end up with, during the period of reduced installations, you actually have a lot of installations that are ongoing because people just put a shovel in the ground as fast as possible in order to kind of get them in the pipeline. So there's a little bit of push and pull on that, but for how long? And the period of time that you're looking at these learning curves is typically at minimum 10 years. So when you start to look at that, the blips kind of start to go away. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Sort of. And look, because there wasn't particularly subsidies, most of them are gone in Australia already,
Yeah.
not entirely, but mostly gone already, and industry growth continues. But R&D is now under threat. Research and development is now under threat, and elsewhere as well.
Yeah, no, certainly that's actually what that.
Sort of saying, well, you don't need it anymore. You've succeeded.
Yeah.
We don't need to help you anymore. But I would argue that curve is going to flatten out because it's being pushed by R&D.
Yeah.
And they are assuming that it's just going on by itself.
Yeah.
So can you pull that out? Can you?
So one of the things that pertains to that is really interesting in the literature, which I would. This is kind of like a background. If I have time, I would do this thing. They currently incorporate breakthroughs in technology within the actual learning curve. So they're not. Some people have argued that you should just break it out and essentially make it an entirely new technology because that's essentially what it is. If you double the capacity of something, it no longer sort of remains in that classification that you originally had it in. So it should be bumped all the way back to sort of the evolutionary phase, not the mature phase. And it should be able to go through the cycle of subsidies that all of those technologies enjoyed in their early stages, if that makes any sense. But no one is currently doing that. They're allowing them all to stay on the same curve. So it would be interesting to see if that had any effect, though. Yeah.
I thought your literature review about learning by doing versus learning by research, the table you showed that had a breakdown, it sort of showed that the learning by doing had twice the effect, roughly, of learning by research, and maybe that sort of gets to answer Richard's question a little bit. Already there's evidence that learning by doing is a better thing to do. Doesn't mean you stop research.
Yeah.
But
there's a lot of research on whether or not learning by doing, and that breaks down to essentially supply push and demand pull policies, whether or not those policies have a greater impact. And essentially what people found is that if you institute just a demand pull policy when you're in sort of an R&D phase in a technology, it does help, but it doesn't do anything close to what it would be doing if you coupled those together. So they're also, those two components have issues because they overlap a lot, right? Especially in that middle part, which is my argument for adding in an interaction term. So yeah, the learning by doing in those technologies specifically did look a little bit higher because those technologies, I don't know if you noticed, but it was natural gas at the top and a lot of more mature technologies coming down the line. So if you look at something like fuel cell technology, R&D blows everything else out of the water pretty much. So, yeah.
Do you separate publicly funded R&D from R&D more generally?
You would ask the hard question. So R&D funding is extremely hard to track, and that OECD measure that I put up there is all the numbers that we currently have, but the problem with that is when you ask a company to report on their R&D spending, the only information that we have reliably for totals are companies that are publicly traded because they have to report it, but they do not legally have to break it down into what they're researching. So it could literally be anything. So those sort of high-level top numbers are the only thing we have, and beyond that, any company that isn't publicly traded, we just ask them, and if they don't tell us, we don't get it. So
we can get some information through where there's a tax incentive on R&D, like in Australia. You can get some estimate if you can persuade the tax office to provide it in terms of how much companies are claiming.
yeah.
But again, yeah, the breakdown's not
We'll
there.
let them fix the census before.
But to pick up on your point, Richard, I don't think the government's saying they don't want R&D. They're just saying it shouldn't be public money. With enough deployment, it moves to private R&D money. Yeah.
Well, that's the idea. That's what they're hoping to push it onto them, right? Or they also tax incentives for R&D. The problem with those numbers also you have to realize is that learning by doing, that includes R&D spending. It just includes R&D spending after the first commercial installation. Does that make sense? So even if those numbers do look bigger, that's still R&D. But it also incorporates anything like economies of scale, depending on what model you're using, or decreases in the cost of installation over time if you're using kilowatt hours as opposed to kilowatts, right? Because those incorporate sort of the profits and all that, yeah.
Could you pull up the plot where you showed the 3 phases? I just couldn't get the... Yeah, that one. How on earth do you decide what the units are?
So that's that baseline metric that I told you about. So essentially they define it as commercial installation of something, and depending on, it depends on what technology they have as to what is defined as a commercial installation.
So it's in effect a very large scale thing. It's basically utility size for energy.
Mm-hmm. So anything that's at the R&D phase would be sort of a test generator. None of that counts in this.
Okay, because you can see, and I mean, you talked about the way there's component inputs into those, but obviously a big issue with the PV space is the very significant role that small scale deployment played in many jurisdictions. 10 houses versus 100 houses, it doesn't have...
So that's cumulative though. So those are... Right, yeah.
So this is very much the idea that you have a utility scale demonstration.
Mm-hmm. Or if you just got a lot of, I don't know what came first, the chicken or the egg. It was probably utility scale for solar PV. That kind of broke the back on this one, no?
No.
Small.
Babies.
Well, I mean, no, not that there's more in Australia, but that sort of like pushed it onto this curve for the US. I would imagine it was.
Huh? Not here.
Right. This is only for the US.
Small scale.
You guys have this one.
And so much of the cost reduction in PV was all small scale applications, starting with satellites to small ground things. The utility is very late on the scene, actually.
It's got AGL on the phone.
Yeah, but that's very late on the scene.
Yeah.
This may be a dumb question, but part of the I thought the idea of this is be able to show in a very simple graph what's going on, right? Mm-hmm. But when you go to your model where you try to split, you have now 2 variables. So how are you going to graph this nicely for someone to?
I mean, currently, essentially what I would be doing is using the learning by doing and learning by research as proxies for supply push and demand pull policies. Does that make sense? So if you look over time at the policies that have been instituted and sort of as this gentleman mentioned, watching the 2 numbers start to diverge, they start to diverge around these levels, which is what led to this theory to begin with of these 3 different stages of a technology. So they start to rely more on learning in the field as opposed to learning in the research lab. So my argument is to sort of go back historically and look for better representations of when those policies started to not make a difference and when they made more of a difference. And in order to do that, sort of break it down on these levels first and look for the tipping point, if that makes any sense.
But there are 2 separate things going on, and then you're going to combine them somehow.
I mean, that's already being done in the 2-factor model. It's only, so all you're incorporating is the cumulative research, the cost, or I'm sorry, the cumulative installation, the cost, and you're breaking research out into 2 components, learning in the field and R&D. So go all the way back, this guy.
So the graph wouldn't really tell you anything. You'll have to go to the tables to see what is the component A, what is component B, and so on, that ends up with an effective number here.
Right, but then you could graph it and hopefully it would look nice afterwards. It would still be on a log-log scale, so it would still be percentage change over time. Yeah. Yep.
You mentioned a couple of times, oh, that only kind of works for 20 years. That's not very good. That sounded like pretty good to me. Like, oh wow, 20 years.
It's good, but if you're talking about like a nuclear power plant, those are usually, it takes 10 to 15 years to build one sometimes, and then they're in the ground for 40 years sometimes. So that's, the lifetimes of generation technologies are long.
So are there other modeling systems where you can say, oh yeah, that's great, it works for 50 years and everyone's happy? Like, is that target, like you're saying you want 50 years, or let's say 100 years foreseeability, and you're saying 20 years isn't great, but is anything ever that good? Any modeling?
Well, no, but my argument is that this should be better. I mean, those variations and those learning rates are too big. They're useless. And you can't compare, none of them are, and part of that is because none of them are apples to apples. If we were all using the same model, maybe they would be closer together, which is those 4 top models use very similar modeling and they're only 2 percentage points apart. So that's, you start to get closer to kind of trying to pull out some of the causal relationships. Because as of right now, I mean, even, so over time, if you're just looking at the learning curve as it stands, the log cost log, it's literally just percentage change. You're just looking at the slope and you're forecasting it forward. That's it. It's just a straight line. And that's what we've been using. And it's been working fine-ish, right? But if you want to break it down and try to actually see what's contributing to those, then it becomes a lot more complicated. And we need that information in order to institute policies. We can't just say, you know, we can't just start willy-nilly throwing things out, but you're not going to sort of maximize your economic benefit by doing that. Yeah.
I don't know if you're already intending to do it, but just I think the breaking down of the learning into the sort of manufacturing or the commodity part and the downstream or balance of systems part is really useful, and especially for a country like Australia, where obviously you have learning by doing and learning by research that occurs in the R&D and manufacturing, and also in the installing and operating. But the commodity part is really an international kind of market, and that doesn't actually happen. From a policy perspective, that's not happening in Australia. So in terms of making decisions about how much to invest in R&D and how much to invest in trying to increase deployment, it'd be really useful to understand where the learning's actually happening, in which upstream or downstream. How important is R&D, because R&D is occurring downstream as well.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah. Cool.
I'll get back to you.
Thanks. I can't wait to find out.
Just with those, you compared the 4 models in a very tight range on technology learning. Are those percentages per year or per?
Those are, that's the learning rate. So that's for every doubling. Yep, every doubling of capacity, how much the cost is reduced.
Because in a lot of models, they actually translate it somehow or another into a percentage a year, right? Because they're doing year modelling.
Yeah.
But those numbers are definitely for doubling cumulative.
Yes.
So,
yes.
okay.
Could be one. These are definitely doubling cumulative. Those are learning rates.
Yeah, no, it was the other table, this one here.
I think yes, they are.
Yeah, it's got to be for doubling.
Yeah. Because there's actually a back of the envelope rule of 20% learning rate. It was actually, the Wright brothers were the first ones to sort of come up with learning curves, and when they were building airplanes, and which is kind of a fun fact. But they realized that it was just every doubling of capacity that they were building, they were just having 20% savings every single time. It was like, where's this magic number coming from? And it kind of, you can see it kind of pops up. There's some of them kind of linger around 20%, so it's pretty interesting.
Could you just show the historical data again for the different technologies? We had nuclear going up, the plot, sorry. It was probably a few slides before. Yeah, that one. It looks like, I'm just concentrating on photovoltaics, but it looks like that's still in the revolutionary phase because it hasn't sort of really slowed down.
Yeah. Well, that curve just continues extending in that direction. Photovoltaics have been really consistent in there.
So is that right? You don't say that it's got to the evolutionary phase yet? It's still in, because you said for the 3 different phases, revolution, evolution, and mature, the slope changes.
Right, but this is sort of pre-log scale. So this is just cumulative capacity over capital cost, and these are international learning curves, not based on the National Energy Modeling System, which is that 3-bucket breakdown. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's only in the U.S. They actually institute on a technology. They say, okay, we see your numbers, we see the kind of trend, but then they start instituting parameters on those for going forward. So when they're looking backwards, it looks exactly like this, but looking forward, they start instituting those breakdowns. Make sense? Yeah.
More questions?
But so just to feed into that question though, they have to make a call as to when it does transition to the next rate.
Yeah, which they do.
And they don't know when to do it. I mean, you could have made that call on PV 10 years ago,
Yeah.
or you might say it's 10 years away.
Exactly. So that is one huge variable that factors into it. And they actually have they've gone back and sort of reevaluated technologies based on that, because they were like, well, maybe we're wrong.
Because the best technology we had with the two curves was definitely gas turbines, where you saw the drop and then a transition.
Yeah.
It's not plotted here.
Yeah.
But yeah, well, you change some assumptions with other assumptions, I guess, don't you?
Very much, yeah.
The challenge.
That's it. Good. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks again.